winter out here right now, but you're about to travel back to 1933 in Algonquin Park. Summer, July and August. My great uncle, Ruthven Colquhoun McNairn, was 18 years old, and he decided to spend a month in Algonquin Park with his friend Colin Cam. And he wrote a diary. He was a young writer. I'm kind of dreaming of summer right now, although it is beautiful. This is getting ridiculous. There you go. Anyways, if you like the content, just pass it on and enjoy summer in Algonquin Park. Ruthven McNairn Diary, Summer, 1933. Algonquin Park. Monday the 17th. Up early in the morning, hopping all over the place, finishing packing, and soon we were off to the station. Colin, Cam, and I, by 9:30. He went up to buy the ticket from the baggage room with a baggage man of sorts, and I went around with the folks in the car to the entrance of the station. We met upstairs and got our seat in good time. The train was swinging along merrily past Burlington when I asked Colin for the baggage checks. He looked dumb and asked me if I was fooling. In other words, we had no checks. A trip to the baggage car assured us that we had no bundles, except one suitcase filled with our rough clothes. On our arrival in Toronto, we were informed that our baggage would be sent on in the earliest possible train, arriving in Algonquin Park tomorrow at 5:30. Our hour in Toronto was passed in buying an axe, writing a card, acknowledging the information regarding our luggage, and getting our hair cut. The train out of Toronto stopped at Parkdale Station for about 20 minutes and then went on quite quickly. After a 40-minute stay in Huntsville, we went right on into Scotia, arriving at 3:30. The train out of Scotia seemed to be mostly freight, with one lone coach thrown in as an afterthought. It left Scotia an hour late and arrived in Algonquin Park Station an hour and a half late, taking 3 hours and a half to go 40 miles. A young chap paddled us about half a mile from the station wharf to Bartlett Lodge, where we were greeted by an anemic old gent named Cameron and Mrs. Bartlett. Here we were supplied with a meal and a half of a semi-detached pair of cabins. The meal was very enjoyable, and the beds in the cabin were too short. Nevertheless, we went to sleep very early.
When the night is calm and peaceful, loving hearts are all in tune. There's two lonesome people in the whole wide world. That's me and the man in the moon. When the little birds are nesting and I listen to them.
Tuesday the 18th. The day was spent in waiting and making preparations for our departure. After breakfast, we had a chat with a couple of ladies, one of whom turned out to be Marion Ferguson. Later, we paddled over to the town and got a ground sheet and made arrangements for our mail. Then we went for a short paddle, an exploration tour around the west end of Cache Lake. In the afternoon, we went over again and got our fishing license and travel permit. Then Mr. Bartlett, who had been away on a fishing trip, returned. he gave us a 7x7 tent and a fairly good canoe for $6.75 a week. By the time we were all packed and had deposited our suitcases with Mrs. Bartlett, we were almost ready to leave. The train, which we had hoped had our baggage on it, arrived only half an hour late. The baggage was on, and we only had to wait an hour for the mail and the checks. Then, at last, we were ready to start our trip, but it was almost sunset. All we could do was make it 2 miles before sunset and camp at the beginning of our first portage. Our supper, made in the dark, was none too complete, but we went to bed, contented with our lot. Wednesday the 19th. We rose with the sun. The lake was covered with mist, and the air was clear and cool. We started the day with a walk to warm ourselves over the trail, where we had seen a family of weasels last night. Down to the falls, mostly an old mill dam. Then we went back to camp and went over the portage. It was not at all bad. Breakfast was slightly better than last night's supper, but took rather long to cook. The Canada jays invited themselves in and watched us carefully all the time we were preparing and eating our meal, stealing little pieces of bacon fat whenever they thought that we were not looking. We were rather late starting, but once away, we had clear going for a while. Over the portage, Colin took the box and tent and light stuff, while I took the canoe and pack. Our canoe might be much lighter for comfort, but it is lighter and much easier to carry than the one Robert and I took with us last year. On the other side of the portage, we had a little difficulty in loading, but wasted little time. After a few yards, we came to a large log which we had difficulty in crossing. As soon as we got over it, I discovered that I had left my sweater at the end of the portage, so I had to hop back and get it. Our river is the Madawaska, and here it is rough and tortuous, sometimes in flat country and sometimes between round-topped hills, bending in real oxbow fashion. It is wide enough for comfortable canoe travel, and no wider, and it is often so shallow that one can just barely scrape over in a loaded canoe. The second portage and the third were not at all difficult. The second had a short climb, and then a steady downhill walk over a smooth trail, and the third was up a railway embankment and along the tracks. They made just enough work to help me get used to the weight. Colin got over them very well. Between these two portages, we saw our first deer. At first, it looked like a brown-colored dog jumping over a hump on the bank, but a few seconds later, I got a good view of it, which proved to be a small white-tailed doe. We both found the experience rather thrilling. On the second portage, Howard Whidden caught up with us, with 5 girls from Northway Lodge. We kept ahead of them with difficulty over a couple of portages and rapids and so on, until we got into Lake of Two Rivers, where we pitched our tent and we had a meal of spaghetti and blueberries. Very soon after dinner, it started to rain and continued on and off for the rest of the day. We tried a little fishing, but got nothing. Mostly we read and talked about various and sundry diverse subjects. Supper was a sorry affair made between falls of rain. The pancakes were damp. Marmalade, however, improved the flavor. Thursday the 20th. We breakfasted at about 7 under rather dampening circumstances. Morning passed with unsuccessful fishing, talking in the tent while it rained outside, swimming and lounging. Remembering Norman's injunction to observe the flora and fauna of the country through which we passed, I made one observation during the morning. There was an unusually stout garter snake winding down a granite slope into a patch of scrubby blueberries. After a hurried dinner, we packed and shoved off, leaving some very necessary articles behind. With 2 miles paddling, we got away again with all our belongings, quite disgusted with ourselves for forgetting what we did. Our canoe was leaking a little, so we decided that we would have to go down to Rock Lake, 3 or 4 miles off our course, to get some glue. There was not a single portage to be crossed on the whole run. We went across 2 rivers, down the Madawaska, Whitefish Lake, to the end of the lake, where we borrowed a can of glue from a cottager. Then we went on to the ranger's cabin at Rock Lake Station. The wildlife was quite interesting. First, just out of Lake of Two Rivers, I saw a sparrowhawk, or some other small member of the same family, pounce on a bird, almost as large as itself, and carry it off. I never knew before that a bird could make so human a cry, or sound so very appalling. Then we saw 3 deer on our way down to Whitefish, 2 bucks, 1 old, 1 young, and a doe. I think that these deer could be classified among the most beautiful creatures in the world. They are more graceful and less angular than the western deer in both form and movement. I might mention that there was an osprey in Cache Lake last Tuesday. That will seem out of place, but I have to get it in somehow, and I forgot it when I was writing Tuesday's doings. At the ranger's cabin at Rock Lake, we sharpened our knife. We had been cutting bacon with the axe, and pitched our tent in a little enclosure made specially for the purpose. After a very tasty supper, we went to bed, wrote letters for a while, then went to sleep. The weekly train goes out on Saturday, so we will be able to get some mail off. Friday, the 21st. When we arose at about 7:30, there was a heavy mist, so dense that it cut out the sun and closed us into a world only 50 feet in diameter. By the time we had had our breakfast, it was quite pleasant. The sun was shining out of a clear sky, and we could see the mist rising from the distant hills. We paddled our canoe, paid a visit to the store down the lake a little, gave the can of marine glue back to its owners, and set out for Lake Opeongo, about 12 miles away. Up at the north end of Whitefish Lake, we disturbed a family of loons. Mrs. and the kids were at one side, and Papa was busy fishing about a half a mile away. We headed for Ma and the young'uns and got so close that they all dove. When Ma finally got to the surface, the kids were nowhere to be seen, so she called violently to Papa, who came aquaplaning over to help her look for them. They were found unconcernedly swimming in a bay a few hundred yards from our canoe. The loons are very interesting birds. Perhaps my reason for this is their abundance, for they are to be seen in every lake in the whole park, and usually there is at least one family with 1 or 2 young in every lake of any size. They have several calls besides the usual laugh, all of which are quite piercing. When they are excited, they have a way of rising half out of the water, exposing their white breasts and calling and beating their wings violently. Our first portage was from near the head of Whitefish Lake into Lake Kearney. It was all of a mile long, but the trail was fine, and we got over it without much difficulty and had lunch on the lake. The next portage was as long and quite rough, and it took us into a little lake, appropriately named Pond Lake. From it, a short portage took us into Little Rock Lake, and by the time we got there, we were so tired that we decided to camp. Deer seemed to be very plentiful through this country. Down at the end of the Kearney Lake Portage, there is what I suppose to be a salt lick, and there are literally hundreds of deer tracks around it. Then in Little Rock Lake, we stalked a doe to within 50 feet and took a picture of it with Colin's little camera. At our campsite, a poor one by the way, I had a wonderful view of a ruby-throated hummingbird, the male of the species. It came quite close to us. We were camped on a beautiful lake, rather small but surrounded by thickly wooded hills. Colin, however, was so disgusted with the campsite, and it really was bad, that he could see nothing of interest in the lake. Saturday the 22nd. We arose at dawn, fully determined to get into Lake Opeongo by nightfall. Breakfast was a hurried affair, and we wasted little time in getting over the first portage, another longish into Sunday Lake. It was an attractive lake, with long bays reaching in from little islands in the center. From Sunday into Sproule Lake, there was an easy portage. Across Sproule, however, was the beginning of a long one. We had a chocolate bar each, and then started out with the canoe and tent. The trail was an easy one as far as we went on the first lap of the journey. It was uphill for a little way, and then a steady downhill path for so far as we went before dinner. Colin took the canoe a little way, and we covered what we thought must be 1.5 or 2 miles at least, and then left the boat in the trail while we trotted back for refreshment and the rest of the load. After a little swim and a good meal, we started off again. After a heap of walking, we passed the canoe. On a little further, we reached the bottom of the hill and a muskeg, into which I fell with the pack on my back. Colin rescued me, and I went up another hill and down the other side into another muskeg. Finally, over a meadow and halfway up another steep hill, Colin found a sign which said, Lake Opeongo, 1 mile. That last mile was a bad one. There were hills galore, roots over the trail, holes, slippery rocks, and heaps of mosquitoes. By the time I got the pack to the end, I was too tired to bother about the canoe. The wildlife along the trail was quite interesting, though rather elusive. I saw what I think was a moose rather indistinctly. It was keeping abreast of me about 100 or 200 feet to the north of the trail, and only once did it allow me to catch a glimpse of it. There was one particular section of trail which smelled very strongly of fox. At the end we saw a hummingbird flitting, or rather buzzing from tree to tree, and an otter swimming out into the lake to pass us without having to get too close. We pitched our tent right across the portage and turned in as soon as we had had a halfway decent supper. Sunday the 23rd. We both got up early.
Come along, what you be calling on, and say good morning, morning, Mr. Bumpy Deadly, Bumpy Deadly, you breaking some circles, break with a shiny little red, your blue.
Colin had had very little sleep between the slope of our camping ground and the deer passing by our tent, but I slept well. We spent most of the morning getting the canoe over 1.5 miles of portage and recuperating from the exertion. Then, after a short swim, we packed up and paddled over to a pavilion beside the ranger's cabin. The pavilion had turned out to be a glorious affair with a huge stove off in a little house by itself and all under roof. We fell to and made a hearty dinner and disposed of it as fast as it was made, and we made lots. Then we went fishing in the afternoon and caught 2 clams. We were, it seems, in the wrong part of the lake. For one thing, it was not deep enough, and for another, there are no fish. On our return, we found our pavilion occupied by 8 people who had completely taken possession. At first, we were raring mad. Then a girl offered us each a salmon sandwich, and we were somewhat appeased. Then it rained and blew hard, and they all came into the rock house where we were, presented us with some more food, and were quite apologetic for not having still more to give us. Though at first they seemed to be the type of people one is not naturally interested in, on further inspection they proved quite entertaining. They left, all 8 of them, in one small car during a lull in the storm. We got busy and made supper, ate it, and were making preparations to turn in on the cookhouse floor when we were interrupted by another party. This time, it was 5 men on a fishing trip. They swore terribly, but hardly drank at all, and they did their best to give us as little trouble as possible. In fact, they were highly amusing. 2 in particular kept the whole party interested. They were 2 fast friends who spent about a month together each summer by choice, and yet they were always quarreling. They quarreled literally over the amount of food which each seemed to have taken over his allotted amount. One objected to the other's use of citronella, and the thrust was parried by an accusation of fussiness, and finally they ate their supper as far apart as possible. Laughing to ourselves, we finally went off to sleep, our feet almost in the oven of the stove. Monday, the 24th. The fishermen got off to their camping ground, leaving us a fire and a cup of coffee each to make our breakfast easier. The rangers, 2 of them, came over and told us that we had crossed the worst portage in the park. I was quite elated. After breakfast, we baked a little, wrote a little, and walked a little. The road, there was an automobile road of sorts from Whitney, is along what used to be an old narrow-gauge railway built by the Booth Lumber Company, who cleared this district years ago. We followed this road for a mile or so, then came back via the ranger's cabin, where we bought some supplies. Bread, butter, and bacon to be exact. After a short chat with them, we went back to camp and dined royally. The afternoon passed, mainly with unsuccessful fishing in very beautiful surroundings. We disturbed a grouse or partridge and saw indications of abundant wildlife. The smaller birds were everywhere in evidence. There were high granite walls in some of the bays. The birch, beech, and evergreen forests were relieved by open meadows left by some forest fire long ago. On our return to camp, we picked up raspberries for supper and enjoyed eating them very much. The sunset was magnificent. The red fiery mass disappeared amid a train of crimson clouds of a type one rarely sees elsewhere. For a few minutes, the whole sky was filled with the color of an ever-changing shade. Then, after the colors died and dusk began to fall, the new moon, so thin as to be scarcely visible, stood almost balancing on the end of the horizon, with Hesperus above it, almost over the spot where the sun went down. Tuesday, the 25th. After a rather early breakfast, we wrote for an hour or 2, and then we climbed a 50-foot tower, which the rangers use for drying fire hose and to get a view of the surrounding country. It is very hilly and very verdant. There are very few places not covered with trees on land. Of course, a very large percentage of the area, however, is water. Lake Opeongo stretches far to the north and east, and there are many other large lakes. Tomorrow is the day set for our departure from Lake Opeongo, so we worked hard to get all of our jobs done. I greased my boots, entered a lot in my diary, wrote home, and made a couple of bags for our food. Colin wrote a 12-page letter to his parents and baked almost 3 dozen biscuits in the oven of the big stove. Wednesday, the 26th. It took us a long time to get packed and away. The ranger took our letters and promised to mail them as soon as possible. Then was the long paddle up to the north end of the north arm of the lake. When we were almost there, we stopped to investigate a certain Gull Island, which is much talked about in this part of the country. It turned out to be an island where some 50 or 100 pairs of herring gulls nest yearly. The nesting season is quite over now, and the young are all off flying. It made an interesting comparison with the Gull Island at Grand Manan. From Gull Island, we fished a little. Previous to this, we had done an enormous amount of unsuccessful fishing. This time, we had a little more success. We succeeded in getting a fine lake trout up to the side of the boat. It got scared, though, and would not come any further. We ate spaghetti for our next meal. We had a rather late lunch at the beginning of our first portage, a new one into Green, Happy Isle Lake. When we were almost through, a bunch of girls came over the portage from Camp Wapameo, Taylor Statons, on the way to Whitney. They wished us a good trip and passed on. The portage, 1 1/3 miles, was new, and consequently a little rough underfoot, but it was over fairly level ground, not too many hills. Once over the portage, we began to think of fish again. Consequently, when we left the shore to cross Green Lake, we let the line out behind us, Ruthven holding the line, Colin paddling. Off a rather wild point, we struck something. A rock. But hang it all, rocks don't jump sideways. It must be some sort of fish. In came 150 feet of copper line, and on the end, to our great astonishment, was an honest-to-goodness fish which we actually landed. We were so surprised that at first we could not believe it. I let in the line again, mainly so that it could be taken in properly. We decided, though, to leave it in for a short while on the odd chance that we might catch another. We did catch it, and in about 5 minutes. Now we had all the fish we wanted, but we had to let the line out so we could wind it up. I let it out very rapidly and started winding as fast as I could, but in spite of my rush, we caught a third fish. By way of much speed, we managed to get the line in without catching another. We have not the time nor the use for more than we already had. About this time, when we were scurrying away for our next portage, we remembered Colin's mackinaw, which had been left at the end of the last portage. We had to go back for it, and by the time we got it, we had to camp in a hurry. The sun had taken advantage of a heavy cloud to slip down to the horizon without our noticing it. We found a shelter hut, which made our tent unnecessary, and a ready-made fireplace in front of it. Of course, the mosquitoes were bad, but after a supper of dried fish and boiled potatoes, we went to sleep very quickly. Thursday, the 27th. Colin woke me up soon after dawn this morning, and I had to trot down to the water's edge and clean a fish for breakfast. What a grand morning it was. The air was cool and fresh, the scent of cedar and spruce, and pine was heavy. The flickers and jays were making a rant about something or other, and a white-crowned sparrow was supplying a melody. We could see the whole length of the lake to where the sun was lighting up the low rolling hills beyond. The spot abounded in bird life. Colin saw a partridge. We could hear a pair of hermit thrushes. Just before we left, I saw what I think must have been a pair of pileated woodpeckers. I will try to verify the observation with the use of a bird guide at Camp Amick or someplace or other. We got away tolerably early and paddled the whole length of Green Lake, and after a little difficulty, we found the beginning of our portage. It carried us over in one short jump into Merchant's Lake, a long, uninteresting lake with almost no islands. We crossed it and took so long finding our portage that we only had time to get the canoe over before dinner time. It was a rather long portage, 1.25 miles as paced out by Colin, but it was quite rough in places. We had the last and biggest of the fish with beans for dinner, and then carried the rest of our baggage over. The portage led to a little rivulet down which the canoe moved with difficulty for about 1/4 mile, with Colin walking along the shore to lighten the load. After the first half-mile, however, we both paddled down the ever-widening stream through a flat marshy meadow down into Big Trout or White Trout Lake. Within 1/2 mile of the lake, we disturbed several ducks and 12 or more herons. The herons had posted a sentinel who sighted us quite a way off, and the whole tribe departed one after the other, leaving 3 of their number perched on dead trees to watch our canoe. The water beyond the first point of White Trout Lake proved too rough for safe canoe travel, so we stopped at an island and wrote and read. The lake could have been crossed, but I felt my responsibility too much to risk it. Rather late in the afternoon, we set out to find the beginning of our next portage, in hopes that we might find a camping site on it. We lost it altogether, however, and had to pitch our tent on a long, narrow island. After supper, we sat around our campfire and talked, and Colin smoked. We were glad to get into bed. Friday, the 28th. The wind has made the lake quite impassable all day, and did not die until sunset. Consequently, we spent all day on our little island in a very lazy fashion. I read Hunting Tower by John Buchan today. It is the second time for me, but the first reading was about 6 years ago, so it was all rather new to me. In spite of the condition of the lake, we had a couple of visitors in the morning. They had come down our next series of portages and are going back over them tomorrow. They gave us a fair and rather encouraging account of what lay ahead of us. It rained a little this afternoon, and now in the evening we are between 2 thunderstorms, one to the north and one to the south. Tomorrow we hope to get into Otterslide Lake, which we should have made yesterday. Saturday, the 29th. Breakfast was very early this morning, but as soon as it was over, the rain started falling. It kept us until almost noon. Well, it finally did clear up. We got moving as fast as we could. As we left our campsite, we saw our visitors of yesterday morning paddling up to our next portage about 2 miles away. The first portage was an easy one, scarcely 1/8 of a mile long, around a waterfall in the little river which flowed from Otterslide Lake into White Trout. Our next portage started about 1/2 mile away and was rather longish. At the far end, we found Howard Whidden and a half a dozen girls busy eating a very nice-looking lunch. We were given quite a welcome and went on our way rejoicing. The next two portages were rather easy, but the best minute of the whole day was when we rounded a bend between the fourth and fifth portage and found a magnificent buck eating the grasses along the edge of the river. It was a huge animal, much larger than the usual scene. I got my camera out as fast as I could, but I was too late to get a picture. On the fifth portage, we met a very queer party. There were 3 men in one large canoe with the queerest assortment of goods imaginable. They were carrying a large supply of cushions, a basket of sour apples, about 30 pounds of potatoes, 2 packs, a tent, numerous battered suitcases and bags and boxes, 1 can of gasoline, a gasoline stove, and about 3 feet of logging chain. Just after we left them, between the 5th and the last, 6th portage, we came upon an attractive little doe. We do not seem to be able to get a decent picture of deer. Over the last portage, and on the edge of Otterslide Lake, we stocked up on the last of our chocolate. Then we planned our course. We had only had 1 meal and were getting hungry. 3 miles away lay the beginning of a half-mile portage into Burnt Island Lake, and at the other end was an excellent camping spot with a shelter hut and fireplaces. The chocolate popped us up to a certain extent, but we were ready for a little more work, so we went on. Our canoe we fixed up for the night at the beginning of the portage, and we carried the rest of our stuff over. The camping spot was found to be occupied by the party, consisting of the 2 men who called on us yesterday and another. The 3 of them were Jews, but very pleasant Jews. They gave us all the room that we needed in the shelter hut, and they did all they could to make us feel that we were not intruding. Just as we got settled, along came 4 canoe loads of boys from Camp Pathfinder. It is an American outfit and not very efficient. It took them 2 hours to prepare supper, and the dessert was a handful of raisins for each boy. They were in at 7, and it was going on to 11 before they were at all settled, and there was so much ready for them before they got there. They were very interesting, but the most entertaining of the whole lot was a little boy not much over 13, if any. His name was Stoddard, and he hailed from Buffalo, New York. His father, old man, owns a chain of drugstores. 4 or 5, I guess. I don't know how many. The boy's main interest in life seemed to be making fun of his parents and having a good time. His family are rich enough to give him almost anything. Sunday the 30th. We decided after much confabulation that we would have to shove on today in spite of the fact that it was Sunday. For one thing, Tuesday is Mother's birthday, and I would like her to receive a letter from me then. A train goes out with mail on Monday morning, too early to catch if we were to start at dawn. And then we like to receive mail as well as to send it. At the end of a 4-mile paddle through Burnt Island Lake, to a short portage into Baby Joe, another portage into a river, a carryover to Little Joe, and we lunched on the edge of Joe Lake. The paddle across Joe Lake was uneventful, except that at the end we met Red, alias Cook, Puck, alias Suckers, and Pat, our 3 Hebrew friends. We paddled down into Canoe Lake to Camp Amek to see if any of my friends were there, but after discovering that there were none, Colin paddled me back up the river while I wrote my letter. Our destination, Joe Lake Station, proved to be not only a station and a post office, but a store as well. I left my letter in the hands of an honest-looking woman who promised to post it for me. Then we gathered supplies for supper and breakfast, and inquired after a good camping spot. The nearest was 5 miles away. Now these pages are written several days after the events took place, so the following sentences will be tempered with a retrospective attitude. While at the store, we got almost our first contact with the outside world in 2 weeks, as life in the park too has been going on a rather uneven keel without our knowing. The Algonquin Inn was doing bad business, and a kid was lost in the woods. The latter incident, it would seem, concerned a lad of a wealthy family, Keith of Toronto, about 5 years old, who got lost when crossing a portage with his parents. If found, he was to be fed very carefully, because he had not eaten for 4 days. Poor kid, thought I. He hasn't a chance in the world. Particularly as he had been lost in the Bonnechere Lake region, which is rather wild. Oh well, what does it matter to me? After quite a paddle, we got into South Tea Lake, where we found an excellent camping spot with almost no firewood available. We went to sleep after a good meal, dreaming of small island-dotted lakes and little rivers, winding between walls of shadowy granite in a gleaming pass. Monday the 31st. We were away really early, headed for Lake Tanamacoon, where we intended to camp while we did our business at Cache Lake, a mile or two distant. The run was not very difficult. After Smoke Lake, past the Northway's large summer residence, over a short but very steep portage, across a small lake, another portage into a larger lake, and over 2 more portages into Lake Tanamacoon, arriving about 1 o'clock. One lake in the morning's run, the last, in fact, out of Tanamacoon, was covered with white water lilies. These lilies are coming out for the first time this year. The yellow ones are almost done. Let's get back to the end of the morning's travel again. We pitched a tent and lunched as quickly as we could, and then set out for Cache Lake, park headquarters, and mail. Mail was good to get. We sat down there on the billiard table in the post office beneath the Highland Inn and went through it all. Colin was disappointed in his exam results, but I could certainly sympathize with them, even though I had no results to worry my head about. After mail, we considered the inner man, providing ourselves with ice cream cones, cold drinks and chocolate bars, cans of meat, and all the things which one cannot get in the really wild wilds. Then, with all this accomplished, we set out for camp. Back at camp, we found another party in possession. This party consisted of 2 men and 2 women who had come out for a bit of fishing. They had a cottage on Cache Lake and were only here for supper. When we arrived, they were very apologetic and offered to move off, but we would not allow it. The place was the best in the district, and was plenty large enough for 6 people, even if it was in 2 parties. They were quite an asset, for they brought lots of food, and what they could not eat, they left with us. It consisted of the greater part of a loaf of bread, 1 onion, 2 sausages, lots of butter, a pot of jam, and about a pound of freshly opened coffee, a can of condensed milk, a chocolate bar, and sugar. They were interesting people in their own particular way. They seemed to have real genuine interest in nothing, but were half interested in people, and somewhat interested in each other. They lived in St. Catharines, and have been through Hamilton lots of times, and is the coffee ready yet, Jean? One of them went almost hysterical when a rope dangling from a pail she was carrying seemed to be like a snake, and it seemed in the twilight to be chasing her. From these people, I've got more information concerning the lost boy. First, he had been found on Lake Louise, not in BC, but just a little south of the Bonnechere Lakes, days after he had been found to have been missing. Second, he was about 16 years old. Third, he had been up to see the tower at twilight and took the wrong path down. Fourth, he said, skepticism on the part of the teller of the tale, that he had spent one night in a tree, literally surrounded by wolves. Fifth, he said, skepticism also, that he had swam lots of lakes. But still, I dismiss the subject with the mental, what is it to me attitude. Tuesday, August 1st. Today is Mother's birthday, and none of her boys are at home. Two are enjoying themselves in the Canadian wilds. One is working in a law office in Toronto, and the other is dissecting fish for the Canadian government. What a family. At least one is on the move. It often makes me think of the man out west, who had never traveled more than 40 miles away from his home in his life. He had never seen a clump of trees or a river or a lake. When I started to tell him of the things I had seen, he said, "It must be fine, but isn't home a good place?" I cannot help but feel, though I would like to wander, and though we all do wander, when we are away from home, we are always looking forward to the day when we will return, and the family will all be together again. This, however, is a diary supposed to record my doings, and not a scrapbook of soliloquies. We breakfasted on cherries, grape nuts, and condensed milk, and biscuits, eating inside the tent rather than out in the rain. The morning passed most lazily, and dinner was a simple affair. The afternoon was a busy one, though. We saw the Highland Inn canoes to discover whether we could get one that was any better than the one we had been using. We found a good canoe, but made no definite arrangements. Next, we went in to get our new travel permit. It takes us the way we came as far as White Trout, then north to Brent and Kiosk, and west to the railway at South River. Mr. Robinson, who makes out the permits, was a very interesting man. He talked about the woods, wilds, and wolves. Finally, he said, "A young child from Hamilton had quite a time a few days ago, down in the Bonnechere Lakes." "Oh?" said I. "This fellow that got lost in the woods?" "Yes, David Fensome. Do you know him?" And then, at last, I got the story straight. David, it seems, was up at the Bonnechere Tower with his father. His father, for some odd reason, went down first, and Dave, coming later, missed the trail altogether. He went south instead of north, as he ought to have gone, and headed right into dense bush. He walked all night the first night, all the next day, with a sort of sleep the following night. First he went up a tree and almost fell out. His axe fell out, and on going down to get it, he found a very comfortable spot to sleep among the roots of the tree. After a while he was awakened by the howl of a wolf, so he climbed up the tree again. The next day he swam 2 little lakes, and in the evening he was found on the shores of Lake Louise and taken right into headquarters. After a little bit to eat and a bath, he was put to bed, and by morning he was fit as a fiddle. His father, though, was rather done in. The anxiety and the strain was terrific. David was cut a little on his legs, but that was all. Leaving the Fensomes, let us return to the headquarters dock. Here we met Mr. Bartlett, and I asked about canoes. He has a slightly wider choice this time than last, and if I can, I would like to get my canoe from him, but we are both tired of the old one. Eventually, with 2 packages of provisions from Eaton's and a few letters, we made our way back to camp. We were quite pleased with ourselves because we found that all the important people at headquarters knew us by name. Wednesday the 2nd. We went into Bartlett's and traded our canoe for one a little better balanced. Then we completed our provision list at the Highland Inn store and headed home. Afternoon was spent washing and writing. In the evening, after a most beautiful sunset, we built up our fire and sat around it and talked. A wolf gave vent to his feelings, not a quarter of a mile away from us. There is nothing like sitting around the fire in the wilds when the night is dark and the night birds and nocturnal animals are making themselves heard. Thursday the 3rd. We both wrote almost all day. I entered up my diary and wrote 5 letters. Then in the evening, after we had had our supper, we went into the Highland Inn, got a chocolate bar and ice cream cone each, spent half an hour finding out that there was no mail for us, and then paddled home in the dark. A little bit of a description of our camp might not come amiss. It is on a lake about 2 miles long and from 1 mile to half a mile wide, tapering off to a point on the western end. Our camp is on the southern side of a point about the middle. The beginning of the first portage on our next trip is on a little bay to the east of us. Directly across the lake is Camp Tanamacoon, from which the lake derives its name. The camp is a girls' camp with a good reputation and a terrible bugler. Our tent is in the middle of an open grove of pines and spruces, with the fragrant breeze always playing about our door. There is a good fireplace, sand to wash your dishes in, and a fine rock to dive from. Friday the 4th. We were up at dawn today. It was a hard job getting up, but we were determined to get away in fairish time. It took us 2 hours and a half to get started. First, we had a very filling breakfast, which took a long time to cook. Then we unpacked all our new provisions and made some alterations on the grub box, packed, cleaned up the campsite, and shoved off by 9 o'clock. The day was a stiff one. Our route took us over 2 short portages into Little Island, a short one into Coochie, and a long one into Smoke. From Smoke we portaged into Canoe, and by means of 3 portages came through Joe, Little Joe, and Baby Joe into Smoke Lake. Then we had a longish paddle to the campsite. We had lunch at the Smoke Lake end of the Smoke Canoe portage, along with the most uninteresting people we have met yet. However, every spot has its compensations. Colin found an enormous patch of large raspberries, and we had fresh berries for dessert. On the campsite at Smoke Lake, we found a party from Camp Minising in possession. There was lots of room though, so we pitched our tent under a little clump of birches with 1 or 2 cedars and spruce around to add their aroma to the clear, fresh air. Saturday the 5th. What a bunch those menacing people turned out to be. When they found us here last night, they said, "Hello." And when they left this morning, they said, "Goodbye." They occupied the shelter hut, but did not sleep in it. In other words, they would not let us sleep in it, but they did not sleep in it themselves. When they left, they doused a very good fire, and our fire was not yet started. Then they had some buttered toast left over, and instead of offering it to us, they left it out in the woods for the animals. Incidentally, Colin became an animal, and we had toast for breakfast. Camp Menacing is a sort of Bible school belonging to some queer sect which has its headquarters in New York. Nobody seems to know exactly what it is all about, but that seems to be the general idea. The people themselves say next to nothing about the place. Today, owing to the fact that I was a little indisposed, we decided to remain right here all day. We passed our time mainly in watching the people pass. First of all, there was a trio from Cleveland, Ohio, camped on one of the Otterslide lakes, taking pictures of animals. There are two boys, about 15 and 16, and a man named LeBar. We met them coming in with a month's provisions last Sunday. Next came an Amic party which lunched here and moved on, giving us a good show of how things are done by a Canadian camp bunch, as opposed to the Pathfinder party we saw here a week ago. Then a party of 3 boys, freebooters like ourselves, from Cache Lake, passed through on their way to Brent, pausing to chat and have a little refreshment. They seemed to be very interesting, but they did not stay long enough for us to really find out. Finally, a man and his son came through from White Trout, bound for their camp about 2 miles down Smoke Lake. They reported seeing a she-bear and 2 cubs, and lots of moose footprints, several deer, between White Trout and Merchant's Lake. By evening, we had the spot all to ourselves. We had laid lots of spruce to make a comfortable bed. I went to sleep early, leaving Colin to do some baking and tidy up camp for the night. In fact, I had done little but sleep all day, and Colin did all the work. Sunday the 6th. Today, being Sunday and Ruthven being in charge, we stayed put for the day. It has been a glorious day, a day of peaceful, comfortable sunshine and calm waters. For the most part, it was spent reading and writing and thinking. Shortly before dinner, we did muster ourselves enough to pick raspberries for dessert. We had the camping spot to ourselves all day. A fire ranger came in to chat for a few minutes in the morning, but outside of that we saw no one. That is the way I would like to spend every Sunday up here, but it works out that way very seldom. Monday the 7th. Our day's travel was not calculated to take us far, so we started rather late. We crossed a half-mile portage to the Otterslide Lakes and ran downwind to the LeBar encampment. There we lunched on beans and bacon from our own pack and stew, bread, and butter from their larder. It was a fine meal, and a very filling one. Then, bidding the folks goodbye, we paddled up the lake in the lee of a large island.
Going down the road feeling bad. I'm going down the road feeling bad. Going down the road feeling bad, and I ain't going to be treated this way.
Halfway up the lake, we came upon 3 otters sporting about in the water. They became very suspicious as soon as we came close and swam over to windward of us and bobbed up half out of the water, snorting in a very queer manner. They are very dark-colored creatures, long and snaky, with a head shaped like that of a seal. They have the appearance of being quite short-sighted. Leaving the otters, we went on to our series of portages. It is the same series as described in pages 23, 24, and 25 from Otterslide Lake into White Trout Lake. After the second portage, it started to rain. However, there was nothing we could do but go on. We covered up our luggage with a ground sheet and let our backs get as wet as they wanted to. Over the 3rd or 4th portage, I do not remember exactly which, I caught a wonderful view of a Chores or least bittern. I cannot say which it is until I get home and can look it up in the bird guide. Then between the 4th and 5th portage, I saw a Wilson's snipe. On the 5th portage, while I was carrying the canoe along, a female ruffed grouse ran along the trail a short distance ahead of me for almost 50 yards. but I am getting ahead of my story.
Going where the weather suits my clothes. I'm going where the weather suits my clothes. I'm going where the weather suits my clothes, and I ain't going to be treated this way.
At the start of the fourth portage, the rain drove down so hard that we decided to stop and take shelter under the canoe. We stayed there for half an hour, Colin feeling very miserable, and I enjoying myself. Finally, at 5:30, we were confronted with the choice of staying under the canoe all night or going on into white trout at once. The fury of the wind and rain had abated, so I decided in favor of the move and a fast trip. We worked very hard for the next 2 hours, getting our tent pitched on our previous campsite on white trout just before the storm broke with renewed vigor. After a supper of cold beans, cheese, 1 square of hard chocolate, and dry cocoa and sugar, we went to sleep with the wind howling around our tent and the rain beating down on it. Tuesday the 8th. The world looks much brighter than it did yesterday afternoon. We are still camped on our island and just about ready to prepare our dinner. I am obviously writing in my diary, and Colin is down on the shore studying German. When we got up this morning, there were deer on the island, but they got over to the main shore before we were able to take a picture of them. A hummingbird came along at breakfast time to bid us good day. It gave me a wonderful view of itself, but before I had seen enough, it hummed away into the woods. I must start the spaghetti now, and set the diary aside until the next chance I get to fill its pages, one by one, with my doings.
What did she die with? What did she die with? What did she die with? The toothache in her head.
Back again sometime later. We set out at about 3 o'clock and crossed white trout to the portage into Longer Lake. Here we met some people from the other direction who told us that we could easily get into Red Pine Lake before sunset and that there were several good camping spots on it. With this as our objective, we shoved on over the portage into Longer Lake. Longer Lake was a rather ordinary affair, long and narrow, narrowing down in the north end to a river. At one place it fell over some rocks, forming a nice little rapids around, which we considered it wise to portage. A little further down, we found another little rapids, which we decided to shoot. It was neither very fast nor very furious, but with enough vigor and half-hidden rocks to give us an exciting minute. Red Pine is a beautiful little spot. It is small and irregular in shape, nestled between high hills and with high rounded islands set in the silvery waters. It was on one of these islands that we pitched our tent and ate our supper as the sun set in a sort of sullen sky. What a lot of beauty one can find in this country. The sun always sets vividly. Poor description. The lakes and rivers are all quite beautiful. Wednesday the 9th. We were away fairly early this morning, down a narrow channel into Burnt Lake, and by means of a lot of paddling, up Burnt to the top. Then we crossed a short portage into Pearly Lake. While we were still in Brent, McDougall, the park superintendent, passed by in his airplane and circled around us once to wave good day to us. Pearly Lake is a very queer affair. Sort of a lake most of the length, but the rest of the way it is very much of a river with waterfalls and rapids. There are 3 portages over a quarter mile in length along it. At the end of the first of the 3 portages, we decided to stop and have lunch. We had planned a very nice meal, but luck was against us. First, we had a great deal of trouble getting enough dry wood to start our fire with. Then the beans upset, and we had to gather them up with a spoon. Finally, some water spilled, and it put out the fire, and we packed up and left in disgust. We did have a square of chocolate, some cold oxo, and a hunk of cheese each. We worked hard for a little while and got across into Catfish Lake and halfway up it. We camped on an island and commenced to prepare for our real meal. To whet our appetites, we had a swim and washed up a little. Then we started cooking. We had heaps of pancakes, an enormous plate of beans each, cocoa and cheese. It may not sound like a very great deal, but all the helpings were enormous. We were too full and too lazy to boil any fruit, and it was all we could do to waddle off to bed. Thursday the 10th. We got away early this morning after eating as much breakfast as we could.
I'm going back where I come. I'm going back where I come. I'm going back to Giles County. My wife died and left me bound.
Our morning's travel took us up Catfish Lake, through a painful maze of islands and points, log chains and deadheads into the Petawawa River, by which we got down into Cedar Lake and Brent and Mail. The descent of the Petawawa was no simple business. It is a fairly wide river and a beautiful one, though at times it is in too much of a hurry. We had to portage over a lumber road for one stretch, 1.5 miles. However, Colin can help with the canoe now, so we got over it in grand style, taking only 1.5 hours to get everything over. At the lower end of this portage, we met two very obviously English chaps who were having a rare old time, though they were both new to the woods. They were canoeing down to Joe Lake and back by way of the Nipissing River. They recommended to us Mrs. Thomas of Kishkadook Lodge for one meal. We have decided to have one meal in these parts, which we did not cook ourselves. Our next portage was, as one of those English chaps had actually described it, a small portage around a fine big waterfall. The fall was a fine one, and we went to considerable pains to take good pictures of it. Then we went down a couple of rather tame rapids to the beginning of the last portage into Cedar Lake. We came upon 2 deer, but they were rather far away. The last portage was an easy one, downhill most of the way around a beautiful but quite inaccessible rapids. Brent was very little over 1 mile across the lake from the end of the portage, and we got there without delay. I found $15, 2 letters, and 3 papers waiting for me when I got there. Our own cooking is very good, but we tire of it, so we dined on canned foods from the store. Corned beef, peas, and peaches, with some biscuits to finish upon. Then we pushed up on the lake to Kishkadook Lodge, where we ordered supper and bought a few supplies. Supper was an excellent affair, and tasted mighty good after what we had been used to. Kishkadook Lodge is run by an ex-policeman from Manchester and his wife. It is a very attractive place, with only 3 guests, a doctor from Ottawa and his wife and daughter. Mr. Thomas talked to us for so long that we had to find our campsite in the dark. We had a 3-mile paddle through a tortuous course and a 1/4-mile portage to Oralee Lake. We found our camping spot with surprisingly little difficulty and settled down for the night quite contented, both as to the inner man and as to the way we were being treated by the world. Friday the 11th. We were up much earlier than was necessary, but much later than usual. We breakfasted in style on some prepared breakfast food, bread, butter, and jam. Fishing was our first activity, and it proved a very successful one. Before we had been out for more than half an hour, we caught a beautiful lake trout, 24 1/4 inches long, weighing, I suppose, about 5 pounds. We took a couple of pictures of it, and then I cleaned it. It was a whopper. Then for the rest of the morning, we lazed and wrote. Dinner consisted of fried lake trout, canned beets, canned peaches, and bread, butter, and jam. We are living in style for a day or two. In the afternoon, when I was progressing nicely with my letter home, we heard an oft-repeated cry that sounded very much like "Help!" coming from the next lake. I decided that it was our duty to investigate and ordered immediate action. In 5 minutes, Colin and I had the canoe across the lake from our camp, and we were climbing the railway embankment. The Northway Ottawa section of the transcontinental CNR line passes through here. Then Colin ran along the ties with me lumbering along behind, to find that all of our fluster was over a couple of children who were playing rather noisily. Very soon after we got back, we had visitors. They were Andy Grant, renamed Andy Gump the Ranger, and his wife and 2 of his kids. His family picked blueberries while he talked to us. He had a terrible time getting Colin's name straight. He went through a long list: Aram, Stan, Pam, Jam, and then finally, after much trouble, getting Cam out. Finally, after talking for a long time about weather, he departed. He had kept us interested and amused for some time, and Colin and I could have been seen smiling at each other as his canoe rounded the first point. After his departure, we wrote a lot more, and then started to prepare supper. Our preparations began with the picking of numerous blueberries. The next step was a swim to provide appetite. The former was tedious, the latter delightful. Then we fried the remaining half of our fish and fell to. We needed no urging. After supper, we were too full to do anything but roll over into our blankets, talk a while, then roll over and go to sleep. Saturday the 12th. We are really becoming lazy. Breakfast was by no means early, but it was cooked, such cooking as there was, in a very leisurely fashion. After it was all over, we paddled over to the railway tracks and walked in along them 3.5 miles to Kishkaduk Lodge, where we bought a few supplies and ordered Sunday dinner, not to mention a long talk with, or rather talk from, Mr.Thomas. On the way back, I saw about 6 hawks, all of the same species. I will write a description here for future reference. They were slightly larger than a robin, were brown on the back, wings, and tail, with a yellowish band across the fairly long tail, black markings on the face, white breasts spotted with black. They were seen flying together along the railway right-of-way. Also on the walk home, we scared 3 deer, probably a doe and 2 fawns, who leapt with exceeding grace, and seemingly with ease, over the track and down the embankment. We picked raspberries by the railway, then paddled home and had a swim and dinner. I spent most of the afternoon reading and trying to get a picture of a friendly little red squirrel. I was more successful in the former than the latter, and that is not saying much. The evening I passed watching the sunset and the gloamin'. Sunday the 13th. Colin left me alone at breakfast. He was not feeling very well, but he could not bear the thought of going without a good dinner at Kishkaduk, so he said very little. The dinner was excellent. There was roast lamb with mint sauce, fresh peas, cabbage, and potatoes, with lots of bread and butter. Then followed a very generous helping of blueberry pie. After dinner, we sat and talked with Dr. Somebody from Ottawa, and of course a long spell and a sad farewell for Mr. Thomas. Dr. Somebody knew of W.H. McNairn, thought a very great deal of George Kilpatrick, and came from Hamilton. His wife was related to the Zimmermans. How very interesting. Yawn hidden very skillfully. Along the track this time we came within 6 feet of a mature male ruffed grouse. He was a wonderful view, and it suffed, especially for our benefit. The dinner was too much for Colin, and after spending a quiet afternoon at camp, he left me to eat my supper in peace, more or less. Then, after another siesta with the setting sun, I went to sleep with the mournful moaning of Colin in my ear. He was, poor chap, really uncomfortable, though I would have had more pity for him had he not talked so much about his condition. Monday the 14th. The dawn, which happened to be that of the day we had set up for moving, was very misty, and on inspection I found that Colin was still feeling quite woozy. I decided that we should not attempt to get away this morning, and having arrived at so momentous a decision, I rolled over and went to sleep again. When I eventually did arise and eat my breakfast, it was alone. Colin ordered 2 slices of bacon and 1 pancake for his breakfast, to be served in the tent. It sounded rather terrible, but he was determined, and there was nothing I could do. The day passed slowly, Colin feeling no better, and I beginning to feel a bit uneasy. Finally, I decided the South River could not be reached if Colin was not feeling better. The only thing to do was to call off the last lap of the trip. It was rather a disappointment, but there was no choice. Tomorrow we go to the next station up the line and leave on the Wednesday morning train for Northway. Tuesday the 15th. Dawn saw us hopping. We had about 20 miles and a 1-mile portage and 2 little fellows to cover before we reached Kiosk, which we thought was the nearest flag station. We were away fairly early. After half a mile of paddling on Oralee Lake, we arrived at the beginning of our first portage. It was a short one, but it was all uphill, and it required considerable effort to shove up it with the canoe on my back. Up Cochon, we had to buck a headwind. Paddling was rather difficult because Colin was not pulling any too evenly. 3 miles of the lake we saw a spot which, according to our map, was a sort of station named Daventry. On the off chance that we might be able to catch a train there, we went on into shore to investigate. We thought at first that it was the deserted village. Then we discovered some chickens, and then some kids. The kids were, generally, not very helpful. There was no way of getting the train to stop. It was not done. One of the kids, though, was a bit more helpful than the rest. He was the son of an Anglican missionary clergyman. His father was on his way from Brent on a gasoline speeder. He was coming up to Daventry and was going to take the train out tomorrow morning. He had made a definite arrangement with the railway company. After a while, the man himself turned up and assured us that it was quite correct. With this information tucked away in our craniums, we went back to the canoe and lunched on a can of meat. The first part of the afternoon was spent baking some cakes, so-called, which we ate, reserving 2 for the train ride. Then we went over to see Mrs. Grant, wife of the ranger who appeared to own most of the kids. She gave us exact information regarding the train, baggage, and so forth. Then she invited us to spend the night on a cot in her house. Day for us begins at 2 a.m. tomorrow. and to spend the evening with them. Next, we had a swim, took some pictures of us in our camping array, had supper, and packed. The evening was spent watching some very amusing movies presented through the courtesy of the Anglican missionary. The end.
Sure as the water moves me, as sure as the earth has its story, as sure as the trees have their wisdom.